the Upfront Toronto podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Upfront Toronto, conversations with people that move the city forward. We're really happy to introduce Len Senater from the Depanneur on College, 1033 College Street. Really interesting and unique person with a really interesting business. Liza is with us also.
Hello, everyone.
So Len, most businesses and most chefs their business will be a representation of who they are, and it will be all about them. And just by doing a lot of research about the Depanneur, and I've been there more than twice as a guest in certain events, the Depanneur is not about you, Len. It's about everybody else other than you, which kind of may say a lot about you. So it was opened 10 years ago. Looking at the website, it says interesting food things happen there. So you do everything. You have food events, you have dinner parties, cooking classes, talks. At 2016, the Syrian refugee kitchen opened, and you were promoting Syrian women making Syrian food, I assume. A really exciting thing is the Depanneur cookbook coming out, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little later, which is published by Simon & Schuster. So that's even more of an accolade to how serious it is and what an impact it can make. Your diversity of Toronto culinary talents. And it's more like a community center, it sounds to me, rather than a restaurant, but I guess combine the two together. I also looked at what the Depanneur was doing during the summer, and you know, it's so like I see the words Syria, Indonesia, Tunisia, Jamaica, Spain, Turkey, Mexico, Philippines, and those are only part of the countries that were represented or showcased at the Depanneur. So really exciting. And so I'm really happy. We're really happy to have you here. Have we missed anything? And
well, it does we do a lot of different things, and it's evolved a lot over the years too. So it's sort of an exploration in kind of where food can take us if we start to play with it in a fun and interesting way.
So Len, I'm curious what got you into the food business? You're a chef yourself.
No, not at all. I actually have no professional training in food. I've not really worked in the industry. Sometimes I even wonder if I'm in the restaurant business at all, because what I do is so unlike kind of what the way a typical restaurant would work. My background was as a designer. I studied photography originally, back when it was all on film, if I'm dating myself here. And I guess if they had told me then that, you know, in the future, everyone was just going to take pictures with their telephone, I would have said, oh, that's the silliest idea I've ever heard. You know, you can get the phone off the wall, the cable's not going to reach. But as it turns out, things took a different tack. Oh my goodness.
All good, all good.
Sorry about that.
We can fix that.
Yeah.
And that's why we have Kent.
Right. Didn't realize that was on. Yes, and so I studied, I worked many years as a designer, as a partner at a small design firm. In a design firm, essentially what you're doing is people come to you with certain problems and challenges, and you have to kind of come up with a creative solution to them. And, you know, we were also trying to reconcile, you know, our personal interests and our personal values into the work that we did. And we were trying to figure out how can we sort of, you know, pursue things that we felt were important or meaningful. But after a certain amount of time in the sort of marketing or communication space, you realize you're really selling a lot of stuff. And I spent a lot of energy trying to convince other people that they should do something worthwhile with their marketing budgets or with their communication endeavors. And I thought, well, you know, maybe I should just cut out the middleman and try and just do something worthwhile myself. And I'd always been interested in food. You might say I've always gone through life stomach first. And I wanted, you know, it had always intrigued me. But yeah, I didn't come from the chef world or the restaurant world. And the idea of frantically cooking the same thing every day for a bunch of people I never get to meet just didn't really appeal to me. I was always more interested in home cooking than fine dining. And I just felt like the city had such an incredible diversity of options and choices. We have a lot of amazing restaurants, but there's also so much beyond the scope of restaurants that we don't always get to try. And so I became really intrigued by the phenomenon of pop-up dining, which was sort of nascent about 10 years ago and seemed like interesting things were happening in other cities, but very little seemed to be happening in Toronto. And I spent some time sort of with that as my design brief to figure out, like, why wasn't it happening here, even though we had so many people and the ingredients and the interest and the capacity. And, and from those ideas emerged the idea of creating a space purpose-built to showcase the diversity of culinary talent that we have in the city, and to do it in an interesting sort of grassroots way. And that's sort of how I found myself doing this.
So when you opened, you had, what was your idea exactly? I know you went through it, but what was going to happen in this? It's a corner restaurant. Mm-hmm. It looks like a restaurant and has a kitchen and a dining room and all. Mm-hmm. How did you envision the first few months would be? And was there, like, did it answer your expectations quickly, or did it take a little time? And if so, how did you go out there to get people to know about the Depanneur?
Well, a lot of things changed. I mean, I leapt in not knowing exactly how it was all going to work, not having a lot of experience. I mean, I knew enough to know that I didn't know a lot of the things. And I originally had some partners lined up. So we had this idea of a three-pronged approach. We were going to run a combination cafe corner store during the day. We'd have a little brunch on the weekends. And then I would host these sort of supper clubs or dinner parties, pop-ups in the evening, and we divide up the work that way. And
it's funny how you do it. You always have plan A, B, and have money coming in, and then do other things. And then it's interesting how things don't always pan out that way.
Oh, well, in this case, the one partner got the other one pregnant and they both moved to Hamilton. And so I was left to figure it out on my own. And I had this naive idea. I'm like, I'll just have to sell some coffee. How hard can that be? Well, as it turns out, it's actually incredibly hard. And, it did take a long time. Actually, the first year was a bit of a catastrophe, and I lost basically all the money that I had on top of what I had spent to create it in the first place. And I had to kind of let go of the staff that I had and sort of bootstrap it into a new kind of business from what I had learned. And a lot of this was made possible by the fact that one of the things that made the whole Depanneur thing possible at all was that the rent was very cheap. The place was an abysmal kind of inconvenience store of like single cigarettes and expired Clamato and vermin. It was not a charming or inviting place, but it was cheap enough that I could make these mistakes. I could learn from this process, and those mistakes wouldn't be catastrophic. And if you can create a space where you can fall down and still have the room to pick yourself up, you have the opportunity to innovate and to try new things and to experiment. And that was something that I tried to play forward with the Depanneur.
What was the moment, can you think of, during that first year? That must have been a really hard year. And a lot of businesses going in, as we said, with an intention, with one intention, and reality kind of either disagrees or agrees with what we wanted it to be, and then we need to adapt. So do you remember a specific moment where it was, oh my God, either I'm going to stop doing this, or and the light bulb went on, and then you kind of and then the universe said, okay, this may work. Was there a moment like that?
I do remember like one key moment, which is the time I did not have enough money to pay the salaries, to pay the payroll, make payroll, right? Like I had my money that I had spent on the building it all up, and which was all done on a real budget. Everything was reused and repurposed and recycled, and and then I had like my operating funds, and then I had like my line of credit that I could dip into, and then it just kind of started digging the hole. And then there was just a point when there just wasn't any left, and I had no choice but to say, okay, I have to stop this particular thing. And it was, and then there was, there are those moments where you really do have to decide where you're going to go with it. And so, but again, the fact that it was affordable allowed me to sort of take risks and to be more resilient in the face of the challenges, and have the room and the chance and the opportunity to discover a path that was actually viable. And my goal was not terribly ambitious when I set out. I was like, I had a 5-year lease. I was like, if I can get to the end of this lease and not be any poorer than when I started, I will consider that a success. That was good enough.
Yeah.
And I even had a little fortune cookie that I had gotten, and I taped it to my computer screen that said, "Enough is as good as a feast." And the theme was like, what was enough? And in my case, I don't have kids, and I think it wasn't a lot. And so if I could just get to enough in the most fun, most interesting, and most meaningful way that I could, that's what I was after. And so, although it was hard and it wasn't obvious, I feel really incredibly lucky to have been able to get there ultimately.
Do you know, I think we need to have an episode about what people stick on their screens, because I have on my screen from a while back at the business at the bakery was, times get really tough and stress goes high, and it was like something like when things happen, when it should happen, they will happen. But I'm really curious about all these sayings that keep us going.
Mhm.
Yeah. So and then you decided to go into social kitchens, I guess, or
Well,
into renting it out.
what a lot of these things were opportunistic things that emerged. So, like some of them were responses to solving other problems. I was running into issues with the city around having two washrooms, so I took over another unit in the building because it had a washroom, because there was no room to put another washroom. And now I had this extra space. How was I going to pay for it? So I began to rent it as a supplemental kitchen, right? And so some of these things were emergent. I mean, they fit well with the idea of being a sort of community food incubator and a hub for culinary talent, but some of them were just emergent ideas that kind of came up along the way that were complementary. And I had planned on doing some events, but I had thought that the daytime kind of cafe operation would be a sort of foundation. As it turned out, that was a whole separate skill set that I didn't really have. And so, I had to pivot. I sort of dialed down a lot of the daytime things, and I doubled down on, the evening and, weekend stuff. And there was times where I was like, staying up at night to host the event and then doing all the cleanup and then coming in the morning to cook the brunch and then running the brunch and then hosting another event. And, it was not easy, but then eventually you develop a sense of like these things are working, and you fine tune the pricing, and also the word of mouth gets out. You build an audience, you build a community, and the things start to become a little more predictable. Though the degree of unpredictability was actually one of the hardest things to get used to in this business.
Yeah, well, you count on other events to populate your store. You have to be able to go through dry periods.
Yeah.
So in 2016, there was the Syrian refugee element. People were coming in, and Canadians were sponsoring Syrians. A group of friends of mine sponsored. We hired a gentleman from Syria to work with us. And so how did that happen? How did you think to open up your kitchen to Syrian women to make Syrian food?
Well, in some ways, it was a natural extension of what we were already doing. I mean, I already had this restaurant that was designed for total strangers and non-professionals to come in and cook and host food events. I mean, that was already in place. The large group of Syrian refugees arrived in Toronto. They were stuck in hotels. They didn't have any kitchens. They couldn't prepare their own food. And we, had a little ad hoc group in my neighborhood. Like, we wanted to help. Right. And we're like, we didn't even know how or where to begin. So I was like, well, I have a kitchen. So that's what I've got. Can I put it to use? And one of the other, you were saying about the sayings that inspire you, and this idea of like, use what start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Right. And that's exactly what we did. So we're like, I have a kitchen. And even if I could just invite them to come, make some familiar food, share a meal amongst themselves, and they can go back at the end of the day, that would be a small thing. That would feel good after all of that discombobulation and dislocation. Just to do that would be a nice thing to offer. And so it started as this small field trip from the hotels to make some food. And then from that, it quickly built momentum. I remember that very first day when they arrived. For some of them, it was the first time they had ever left the hotels. And they come in and everyone's uncertain. And I'm just like, you know what? I didn't have the Arabic. I couldn't communicate. And I was just like, you guys, just cook. Just make whatever you want, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. And once they realized that they were like, get out of my way. And they just like kind of took over the whole kitchen. And in no time, pots are bubbling and knives are chopping. And they were just, in their element. And you just stood back and let them do what they were already really good at.
Do you remember any specific woman who came and like with a personal story?
No, absolutely. I mean, there was a young couple, Rahaf Al-Akbani and Ismail Abu Fakr, and they had good English skills, and they had been working sort of as social workers and advocates in the Turkish refugees camp. They themselves were Syrian, and they were in the hotels, and they were one of the sort of small group of people who were interested in helping, met them at another event where they were advocating on behalf of the group of people that were in their particular hotel. And it was through them that we were able to extend the invitation. And they are the ones who spearheaded the trip down to the Depanneur, and they became very much the linchpin, our liaison into the community. There was also a lot of credit due to my associate, Kara Benjamin Pace, who ironically I had hired at the time to help me with new business development as I had reorganized some of my schedule. I had a free day in the calendar. I'm like, what should I do with this day to make a little extra money on it so I don't have to work so much? And I ended up starting a whole second Depanneur that didn't make any money at all, but ended up being one of the most high profile and ultimately most rewarding things to come out.
So you didn't charge money for that. They just came and cooked. Is that how it happened?
Yeah,
or did you open up the kitchen and sell food that they made? What was the concept behind that?
Initially, it was really just come and cook, make some food, and bring the leftovers home. Yeah, but pretty shortly after we began, they were essentially relocated into their various homes. They now had their own kitchens. That crisis, of not having any way to cook had been addressed. And so the immediately became apparent that there was an interest in, can we make any money? Could this be an employment or a revenue generating opportunity? And I was already hosting pop-up food events, selling tickets online. I had been doing this for many years. So it was just, again, a logical extension of the sort of micro-entrepreneurial support that we had been doing for food talent in the city for many years. And we said, yeah, let's do it. Let's facilitate this entrepreneurship. They have these remarkable skills. Let's just close the distance between them and a marketplace that was really interested in helping out. And it felt very equitable and very empowering. It wasn't a form of charity. It was a business. They were creating something of value. People were happy to come to the table and pay for something. They got a product that they were delightful with. The women got to use the skills that they had, contribute positively to the larger narrative, feel a sense of worth and belonging, and a sense of welcome in the community. And so there was a lot of really great emotions kind of working in both directions. And this made it a good story. It was very timely. So we got press, and the thing snowballed very quickly. And it ran as a pilot for almost 3 years.
Are you in touch with any of those people?
Well, Newcomer Kitchen evolved into a nonprofit organization, a formal nonprofit organization. Like technically, I'm still on the board. But that was actually ultimately more difficult to figure out how to make this little sort of grassroots idea work within the very constrained framework of the nonprofit organization as it is structured in Canada. And it became a nonprofit, and in that process, it had to change a lot. And it's now out in the world doing, important work, but it's become something quite different than the thing that I started. So I'm not directly involved in the hands-on sort of day-to-day activities of Newcomer Kitchen, but it's still thriving. And like Rahaf and Ismail became close friends, and they're also both very talented musicians. They went on to help found a Syrian children's choir in Toronto, which they took on tour, and have been collaborating with different musicians and playwrights in the city. So they're actively becoming involved in that. Since then, they've also had 2 young children. So they've been very busy as well. So I've watched them grow and flourish, and so we're still in touch.
When I talk to young entrepreneurs, they ask what should we do? What's the main thing we should do? And when I look back at my time, I think that the places I've benefited the most were when I was involved with nonprofits or volunteering or whatnot, and you meet people there that are just I just liked, and I can't say how many friendships have formed for me when it came from nonprofits. And I think it's because you share, you want to do something for the community, you want to do something that's not about you necessarily, and then maybe that's where you align and friendships become. It's such a nice place to be, and the Depanneur seems to be hover around business and community, and not hover, that's where you're at, but you're touching all those worlds all at once.
Yeah, like I said, sometimes I don't think of myself as being in the restaurant business. Sometimes I think of myself as being in the sort of meaningful experience business, and I just happen to use food as a way to get there because it's a really short, quick, easy, what they call sometimes the MacGuffin. It's the device that I use to advance the plot towards the actual moral of the story. And so the food, the experience is the product. The food is sort of the souvenir and the means by which I make it happen. It's because it's something that everybody hasn't. There's never been a person who doesn't eat. So it's the most fundamental and universal of all human experiences, something we can all relate to, and it leaps across language and culture and age and race and gender and history and class and all of these things to create this shared experience. And that's what I was trying to do. Food has this amazing superpower to connect people. And yet when you go to a regular restaurant and you sit at your table and you order your meal and you eat and you leave, it's this missed opportunity. You haven't done anything that takes advantage of this remarkable thing that food can do. And so that's what I wanted to put at the center of the plate. And that's what I wanted to make the table about. And, not the luxury and status and decadence of, fine dining.
Yeah.
And that's really the project as it evolved.
So when I went to the Depanneur, I was at an event by Mike Bresick, and the word meaningful, I think, is in common both for you and from him. He's from Wayfinders, and now, he takes people, entrepreneurs around the world, and creates really meaningful trips, which I've been to one of and was outstanding. And I really like that word meaningful, is if you instill meaning into an action, into a get together, and it's not just about, like you said, to see and be seen, it makes it a completely different experience. Do you remember, is there any experience that stands out for you from the past 10 years that you feel had the strongest impact either on you or on the community? I know we talked about the Syrian refugee element, but you got a lot of press from that. Is there anything else that stands out personally, that you stood there and you felt so good that it was happening?
I mean, there's 1,000 little ones, but some of them they're very subtle. I mean, I'm originally from Montreal, which had in a place where the social fabric was woven somewhat differently. And I came to Toronto, and it was a more challenging place to have these kind of intimate, friendly, unpretentious, sort of meaningful connections. I found it a challenge. And so I was sort of creating this nostalgic love letter to the kind of relationships that I missed from there. And, to see a bunch of strangers come and sit at a table and start talking to each other. And these meals are served family style. So people have to pass the plates to each other, and they serve each other. And then they're handing food and they start chatting, and they're like, oh, here, why don't you taste my wine? And all of a sudden they're talking and sharing stories, and there's friendships are emerging. And that alone, it's not a big thing, but it's an incredibly rare and difficult thing in a city like Toronto that's so busy and everyone's so preoccupied, and and all of these other little details that inhibit those kind of things. So just to see people making connections and being friendly and sharing is itself very rewarding. And then to talk to the chefs and have them come to the table with their pride and their stories, and sharing the recipes, and to give them their opportunity to do something that's important to them, and to share, and to be validated, and to have other people. I mean, a lot of chefs, they never hear other people, the only thing they ever hear about their food is when people send it back.
It's true.
How often do they actually get a round of applause when they get to see people really enjoying the food that they make? So the idea is, if it was more fun and interesting and rewarding for the cook, then it's going to be more fun and interesting and rewarding for the diners. And then the whole thing is going to become more than the sum of its parts. And people are going to leave with a really, I thought about the kind of food experiences that I've had that I really cherish, that I remember the most. They're not the ones I spent the most money on. Right. And so they were like, how do I foster more of those kinds of experience? And that was sort of what the Depanneur became. And to have been able to do that hundreds, maybe even thousands of times, I mean, that's what makes the whole project meaningful.
Yeah. For me, it's a good restaurant experience is the company was awesome, and so was the food. It's funny, Liza's cook is laughing. I know she's busy boiling down tomatoes, right? So talking about large family events.
Yeah, we're in harvest season, as I'm sure you know. So yeah, it's a combination of a lot of work, but also a lot of pleasure. So, but I wanted to ask you, Len, when you came to Toronto and you said it was challenging, was that because of the pace of Toronto versus Montreal?
Well, it was different. I mean, it's a combination of a lot of factors. I was born in Montreal. I grew up in Toronto. I went to high school here. I lived briefly in France, and then I moved back to Montreal to keep my French going. And I developed all kinds of wonderful friendships there. And then I traveled, and then I came back. And with the inertia of traveling, I wanted a change and a fresh start. So I moved back to Toronto, and I got involved. I got my first real job and all kinds of other things. But there were a lot of little details about how the kind of interpersonal culture is woven in Montreal versus here. And a lot of it has to do around affordability. I mean, Montreal at that time anyways, was a city you could afford to be broke in. And people themselves were underemployed, but they were creative. And so they used their surplus creative energy to do fun and interesting things for and with each other. But those things themselves couldn't be fancy because no one had any money to spend on them. And so, you really invested in each other and in the experiences that you shared together. And coming to Toronto, I found it was because it was a much more expensive and ultimately more ambitious city, everyone was really busy. You had to schedule everything. People lived all over the city. You had to coordinate things. Things closed earlier. You wanted to get a bottle of wine, or you had to make a special trip to the liquor store, and you had to get there in time before you got to the bar, which the thing Subway was going to close. And all of these factors just made it hard to spontaneously hang out with your friend who you bumped into on the street. And then, and the quality of the friendships that emerge from that is also different. And I guess I missed the kind of languorous sort of long dinners, the easy, relaxed pace of socializing. So I said, why don't I make a little space where that could happen?
It's today, almost any restaurant that you go into, they will verify with you, and that's, sir, you have 2 hours until you have to move on. So it's oh yeah. And this just happened and I don't blame restaurants. Restaurants need to turn the tables. They need to earn a income to pay for everything that happens. So, but it's just a reality of life. Len, where do you see the Depanneur in 5 years?
Well, that's an interesting question too, because I've been doing this now for 10 years, and now obviously COVID has caused us a major refactoring of what I was able and capable to do, and then we had trying to again do what I can with what I had, sort of pivoted into this new cookbook project, and that project itself is turns out that an anthology of 100 contributors with the stories and everything's a lot of work. So that's emerging into new things. And then there's a whole kind of storytelling that's emerging from that project, which I think is going to open up new and interesting doors. So, but also, I'll just take a little digression here. Just pre-COVID, I was hitting another sort of inflection point in the evolution of the Dep. I was working a lot. We had events 7 days a week. I was curating and hosting and marketing probably in excess of 300 events a year. And it's a lot for one person. And, and I was talking to my mentors and my community and saying, I don't care if this makes more money. I just don't want to work so much. I'm getting burnt out. And so, one of the feedback was, well, you might have to make more money if you want to work less. And that sort of shifted my thinking around scale and so on and so forth. And so I started the idea of a new location that had more capacity, that was bigger, trying to figure out what will scale, what won't, what will get lost, what will get gained, what works. I don't want it to, if you make it for 150 people, it's a fundamentally different thing, and with a different set of skills and a different kind of equipment. And, so thinking about that, but then I really got overwhelmed. I was like, I can't conceive of and execute the creation of a whole new Depanneur while I'm running the current. You can't change the tires while the car is moving. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to park this thing. When I was 25, I spent I took a year off. I traveled around the world, and I said, oh, now I'm turning 50. Maybe this is like the quarterly report. I'll do a check-in, and maybe I'll do it again when I'm 75, because I'm probably not going to do it when I'm 100. So take a year off, take a sabbatical year, and think and reflect on what it is that where do I want to take this idea? And, so I kind of moved away from the expansion, and that was just when COVID landed. And so in some ways, one of the interesting and paradoxical lessons of this was that I reached the limit of the smallness. I had always wanted it to be small, as the smallness was an insulation against certain challenges and certain, different things. And then as I started considering growth, and then the circumstances changed, it was the smallness that saved me. And the smallness was the heart of the resilience that allowed me to find a path through the difficult time. Had I signed a brand new lease and done an expensive new build out just pre-COVID, well, that would have been catastrophic.
Lady Luck is a player in everything we do, if we realize it or not. I've heard so many stories of lucky people and less lucky.
Yeah.
I just want to say, as a side note, you are a storyteller, man. Like you just said a few minutes ago, you're writing a nostalgic love letter. Holy shit. Like I heard that and I'm like, oh, it sounds so good. So just as an observation, you are a definitely storyteller. And like when you describe the Depanneur, I have been there, but I want to be there even more now because of your descriptions.
Well, maybe in this, I'll just talk about the Depanneur, like, for those who don't know, like a Depanneur is what you call a corner store in Montreal. So all the corner stores are, the way we would say convenience store, variety store, they would say Depanneur in Montreal. And this used to be an old corner store. Yeah. But also there's the etymology of the word itself. So, if let's say you're driving down the street and your car breaks down, you would say, je suis en peine, meaning like I'm stuck, I'm in trouble, I'm in a jam. And so the dépanneur is the person who would come and get you unstuck or out of trouble when you're stuck. Wow. In France, like a dépanneur would be like a tow truck driver or a roadside assistance mechanic. But in Quebec, I don't know, it was different. It was like, oh, it's 10:30 and I need beer and wine and cigarettes in May West. Like
saving my ass. Yeah.
Who's going to save my ass? Oh, they're open. I was a Montrealer with a corner store. So the name seemed kind of obvious, but I felt like food in Toronto was also a little bit en peine, and maybe I could le dépanner a little bit. And that's what I've been doing. So this theme, and this is kind of coming to the surface as I write the story of the Depanneur for the book, the themes of what I learned about meaning and what makes a happy life in Montreal, which were very modest, sort of artistic bohemian values, right? And how did I carry those into this project after 10, 15 years as a designer, and how those have sort of led this. This is part of what I'm exploring and unpacking as I write the book.
Do you find that your thought process is different when you write rather than not, where thoughts present themselves differently just with the pace of typing or writing?
Yes, I mean, part of hosting 1,000 dinner parties is there are certain stories that you tell, over and over, and these questions of like, where did it come from? So some of these things are the little scripts that you have developed, but they always change and evolve over time. What the writing is revealing is sort of the kind of relationships between these little stories and the larger themes that are embedded in them. And that's interesting for me. So it's a cookbook, ostensibly. It has 100 recipes from 100 different cooks with over 80 different nationalities. I think it will really reflect Toronto in a really unique way. But my part is very much a memoir too. And from it are surfacing some of the larger themes that have animated the work that I've done that even were not obvious to me when I was doing them.
Yeah, identifying the invisible thread running through all the stories and the events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Montreal and the lessons that it taught me turns out to be an even bigger one than I realized at the time when I called it the Depanneur. Right. And another theme in that is that idea of the affordability, and because as gentrification and income inequality become these very predominant sort of social issues, it really realized how crucial it is to simply you can't have a vibrant local food ecosystem if there are not affordable places.
Do you think you'll be able to do it in Toronto just because of, I guess, accessibility and finances?
It's unclear. If I had been paying full market rent from day one, it never would have survived. If I had been paying full market rent from day one, I never would have been able to pay forward the affordability of the thing to all the hundreds of fledgling cooks who used it as a launch pad to their own things. And if I would not have been able to make mistakes and pick myself back up again, I would not have been able to take creative risks because I would have had to play it safe because I had, and all of this thing that the Depanneur is a shining example of are at risk in a city that becomes exceedingly more and more expensive. And so if I'm going to sort of take a lesson from the last 10 years. It's like, what is at risk when affordable places vanish from the urban landscape?
Please tell me that all of this is going to be in the book, Len.
Well, these are, I mean, that'll be a question a little bit for the editor, right? And how long they want it to go. But I am,
Right.
you know, in addition to simply telling the narrative of what we did, I'm also trying to see what lessons can I take from that, right? Both looking back lessons, but also looking forward. You know, what can we learn about what makes a city great? What details of the way a city is structured can conspire to create good friendships or conspire against that possibility. And, you know, this is a theme that I have been exploring for a while. I developed an informal partnership with an organization called the Urban Land Institute that works with a lot of architects and developers around the world. And I knew someone who was involved with the Toronto chapter, and we began an interesting conversation on the idea of social purpose real estate. You know, simply about having places that are for things other than the maximization of profit and revenue,
Yes.
right? And what are the implications if the Dep found its place in the little cracks, you know, the cracks
Right.
in everything where the light gets in.
And
Yeah.
Len, I really love that. I think, sorry for bursting in, but like the social purpose of real estate, we need it in the city. And because everything is, you look at every neighborhood, even your neighborhood now where the Depanneur is, I mean, it's so different than it used to be 10 years ago. I used to frequent the coffee shop not far away from you, the Common. The whole area is changing, and prices are driving a lot of businesses out. So I would love to talk to you later about this initiative if I can help in any way.
Sure.
Because
Well,
this is where this is where the soul of the city may rest almost. And because businesses have to target the lowest common denominator in order to hit as many people as possible, to bring in as many people, to pay everything. And all that is needed, but also the soul, the quirkiness, the area where logic doesn't exist, right? And art and mistakes and God knows what, and humanity. And these are driven a little out by this.
Well, it's a creativity and innovation are at risk because, you know, if the stakes are incredibly high and the investors have sunk a ton of money and you need to be wildly successful just to break even, you're not going to try something risky or untested. You're going to try to find whatever's the trendiest thing at that particular moment, milk it for all it's worth, cash out while you can. And so you end up with all these copycat derivative food project. I mean, my God, if I see another barn board Edison bulb fish taco, like I'm gonna lose my mind, right? It's like, you know, and it's more pernicious than that too, because, for example, the Depanneur was, you know, an immigrant who bought the building in the 60s and, you know, paid it off because they could make enough money to actually own the building and to pay for it. And then the kids inherited, and now it's changing. And now if I looked at buying the building once, right? Even if I could somehow figure out how to finance it, by the time you were fixed it up and paying the mortgage, I couldn't afford to be a tenant there. I would have gentrified myself out of a place. And so not only are we losing these mom and pop places that have developed a little bit of immunity to the gentrification because their buildings have long since been paid off, when they go, we actually lose the next generation of those people because the current inhabitants won't become those people a generation from now because they can't afford to own those buildings and earn enough. The rents have disconnected from the earning capacities of the spaces that they're in. And so who wants to be in a place that's just Rexall, A&W and Starbucks? I mean,
no, you don't want to be,
you know, they already have it. It's called the suburbs. And so I see the suburbification of the urban center. And ironically, the suburbs are now where things are cheaper. And so now you see vibrancy emerging there, you know, in a way that it's harder to have in the city.
Yeah, in a way, like it's a natural progression of things, and it's almost impossible to fight. But you need to find those, like you said, the parallels in which you both can coexist, and maybe work with corporations that have real estate that are willing to give a night a week, or I don't know what, or spaces they are not using, while other spaces are making the money. For elements that contribute to this delicate social balance of the city.
Well, it's a question too of whether we want, if this is a social problem, do we want it to have a market solution? Do we let the wealthy corporations decide who gets to exist at their whim? Or do we solve this as a social and political problem, saying, no, we need to have things in place that help, that stop runaway gentrification and put rent controls in place and protect the integrity and viability of like you said, the soul of the city, right? And the Depanneur is very much an example. If you keep things cheap, if you lower the barrier to participation, you simply hold the space, all of this amazing talent and capability will rush in to fill that space. I didn't have to do a lot to fill this with talent and delicious food and wonderful people and exciting things. I just had to make it accessible and affordable, right? So
yeah, I kind of just disagree a little. I think it took you being in that location for those things to happen. And I'd say 9 out of 10 of the people that would rent that specific space would not do what you're doing. Yeah. And they would, they do whatever they do to live, and it's appropriate and all, but just what I just think it's really, we need to pay attention and give you tribute to what you're doing, because it's not everyone would do it.
Well, there is this thing that I'm exploring, which is this idea of like a privileged jujitsu, right? It's like, you have this, can you lift while you rise? Like, if I have these advantages, what do I choose to do with them? Right? So I was very lucky. I'm incredibly fortunate. The DEP is a product of a certain kind of privilege. There's the privilege of having had a really good job, having saved up enough money to buy my house at the last possible second when I could, of turning it into a 1-bedroom apartment that I could live in while I rent 2/3 so I could afford to pay, of not having kids to make this possible. If I had to pay rent, the DEP would not have survived because I wouldn't have made enough money to pay a Toronto rent. But so I built on, so another way of looking at it is I subsidized it with what I would have been paying rent otherwise. So I took the good fortune that I had accumulated in my life, and I made a conscious choice about where I wanted to apply it, right? And I wanted to spread it around, and I wanted to use the opportunity that I had to create more opportunity for more people. And so in that way, yes, I hope that we could inspire the people who have greater privilege and who have greater opportunity to find ways to pay that forward, but not necessarily in a prescriptive way, but in a way that allows things to emerge.
The place in Kensington Market that was a common kitchen and something about community on Augusta, but it had to close. It didn't succeed. Yeah. I know it was
that was Paran Kothardi. It was called Livelihood, I believe. And he actually was interesting. He was we had developed a relationship with him very early in the days of Newcomer Kitchen, and he actually sat on the very original board of directors for that project in its early days. But he had come from the sort of high finance world of banking, and he had ambitious ideas around how to use technology and AI and things in working with refugee resettlement around the world. I mean, it was a very grand and ambitious project, of which Livelihood was a little kind of experiment as part of this larger thing that he did. And then eventually we sort of parted ways and both took our own approach to solving the problems. The scope of his vision was a lot bigger, but then where it ultimately ended up, I don't know, because I didn't necessarily follow through. But part of the Depanneur too was, we all struggle with the things that seem broken in the world, the things that seem irreparable, or the trajectory that seems to be leading us to problem. And I was like, I can't fix all the things that are broken. I will run out of energy trying. Why don't I just try to make a little something that feels a little less broken and devote myself to this thing, and from that, just tend my garden and try to make something of value and of integrity and of meaning in my little corner of the world.
Well, you're definitely doing that. I mean, you're definitely doing that. And that's why I'm thinking this is so much more than a cookbook. Please put your thoughts in this cookbook, have a chapter of that, because it could be so much more than a cookbook, just to inspire people to cook.
It's like part cookbook, part memoir, bit of a manifesto. It's a little bit of all those things.
A hidden manifesto embedded in a cookbook. I like it.
Yes.
Yeah. And there are other interesting food projects around the world. Again, because one of the reasons I think you have this podcast is because food touches so many different sides and aspects of our lives and our society. There's almost nothing that it doesn't connect with. And so, through working food, I see, entry points into all these different issues that connect to us. And hopefully that'll come through in the stories as well. And then as we gather the stories from the 100 cooks who are contributing, and we include those stories in the thing, then that becomes, a window into, how all these places touch and intersect with food at the center.
Right. So you live in Toronto now. And where do you live? I mean,
I live like around the corner from the depth. Like that's part of the idea. And
do you find that Toronto is now home, or do you still have your heart in Montreal?
Well, there's a saying in French, un cul entre deux chaises, like an ass between two chairs, right? And so, so I feel a little bit like that. There's definitely a part of my heart that is in Montreal. I just went back this summer. That's the longest. COVID made it the longest time has elapsed since I've gone back to visit and reconnect with my friends. So I really, to go back there, and it was actually for a memorial for a friend, and to have this sort of reunion of all these people and to see the fabric of community that is there, and it's incredibly tightly woven, does make me miss that. But then I also watch the very aggressive Toronto style slash and burn gentrification that's taking place there too. And I fear for the soul of that city as well. So Toronto is where I live. It's where, it's where my family lives now. I'm here, but I am interested in this idea of a sabbatical year and doing some traveling if and when the traveling comes, and then seeing what opportunities kind of emerge from that. And maybe I take this show on the road, and maybe I do events in different places, and maybe, I want to see what possibilities emerge. I do like the idea of, this Depanneur 2.0 manifesting in Toronto, in where I live. But between now and then, I want to sort of see what I can do.
Right. And how have you, this has been such a journey. I'm exhausted just listening to you. I'm like, how has he done this all?
You need a sabbatical, Liza.
Right. So who has been kind of with you through all of this? You obviously have good friends, you have family, but is there anyone that's kind of been your sort of rock, or your person that's kind of been there through
there's been a lot of people who have helped at different points in time. Certainly for Newcomer Kitchen, there was Cara Benjamin Pace, as well as Rahaf and Ismail. That project would not have happened without their devotion. And now with Tamara Chaikin is involved in making that project go forward. So there were those things. And then there were different people throughout the history of that who would come on for a year or two and help me get through particular places. There's been a larger community of friends and advisors who I turn to when struggling. But and I have my partner in life who, who's been supportive of everything I do, even if they've sort of, there was a time where she would come and like help serve once a week, and then she got to a point where like, I'm not doing that anymore. So there was there were limits, to that. So, but so no, there hasn't been like other people who have weathered the whole journey, but it certainly has not been something I've done entirely alone. And I've relied on a lot of people over this time. And I hope to thank them in the book too, because their contributions are key to making this. It takes a village, and it takes a village to make a village, and that's essentially what we've been doing. Yeah.
And how has the city been to work with? Have they been, oh dear.
Yeah, the city was different. There's like a whole section of this story, which is how difficult everywhere this place touched the official infrastructure was a challenge and a problem that took everything I had to find a way to dodge those bullets. I would say that very little happens in this city that doesn't, that's outside of the box, because the box is incredibly rigidly built. And that itself begs the question, who decides on the shape of the box and who benefits from it being that particular shape? And so a lot of what we did was a question of another, again, these sayings that inform you. It's easier to ask forgiveness than it is to ask permission. Right. And there's a lot of things. I think
every business person goes with that.
It's a common thread.
We just had to do things. We just had to leap out and take the risk and do it, and then figure out afterwards. You have to bite off a little more than you can chew, and chew really hard. I think technically I've been wildly underinsured to do any of the things I've ever done. Right. If you have a catastrophist worst case scenario mindset, I don't think you're cut out to take the risks, personal risks necessary to do something brand new.
Yes, because it's business, but really it's quite personal as well. So, and with that, is that the case because the Depanneur didn't fit into a box of being just a restaurant or being just a, does all these different things?
Yeah. So
or is it just because the city deals with it the way it deals with
well,
it?
if you want to open a 600-seat Kelsey's in a strip mall in, a suburb, then the box fits very tightly. It's a very, it's a known thing. But like you said, this doesn't fit into any tidy category. So, and even explain, and in the cases of a lot of bureaucracies, whether it be with zoning or with municipal standards and licensing, or whether it be with insurance, the minute you start describing something that doesn't fit in the box, well, the default answer is no, because nobody wants to be accountable and no one wants to put their ass on the line. The only person willing to do that is the entrepreneur themselves. And so my thing is like, look, if you're not going to help, at least stay out of the way.
Right.
And sometimes it's hard because they'd rather it just not exist than something not be under their direct control.
So with that, talking about the city, what do you think is one of the biggest missed opportunities for the city?
Well, I mean,
we ask this hoping that the city is listening.
Well, I'd say one example would be street food. I mean, we have the population, the ingredients, the talent, the diversity, the interest, the disposable income. We could have one of the most vibrant and flourishing street food cultures in the world. And instead we have hot dogs, right? Because of the ridiculous overregulation.
Do you remember a few years ago when they were designing the streetcar, not the streetcar,
the a la carte program.
Oh my God, it was it was the worst.
I don't.
Only
can I swear
government
on this podcast. I don't.
You can swear. Yeah,
they were only I don't know. Only government could have come up with such a shitty program to design one stand that fits all. Everybody had to adhere to it, and it was a huge flop.
And it was $70,000, which defeated the entire purpose of having. I mean, go to Mexico City, and I went to stay in a place. I could have eaten a fabulous meal on the street every day, every meal for a month at a different thing, and none of it, was because the city regulated. It was simply because the city didn't stop it from existing. People are not idiots. They're not there to poison their customers. They're there to survive just like everybody else, right? They operate with an entrepreneurial integrity because the stakes are high. They just were not forbidden to do it. And from that flourished this incredible richness of opportunity and diversity and choice. And we could do that if the city could just find a way to step back or even create spaces, right? So like, okay, there's a lot of topics here, but there's a pernicious idea of fairness when it comes to regulation, that the way you regulate a multinational corporation is exactly the same way that you regulate a food stall. And that's got to be fair because everyone needs to abide by the identical. And whereas
the food stall really does need a 20 by 20 washroom attached, like you cannot operate one without that, because honestly, I think you can almost have an orgy of within that kind of room, and the sizes are crazy. And I'm for accessibility, but it's getting to be ridiculous.
Well, and again, if you're doing a new build or you're building there are places where this makes sense, but that it's fair. So you have to, what happens is it's the type of like regulatory AIDS, like it's a disease that infects the very system that's supposed to be protecting you. And then it uses that system to cause you greater harm. So the companies and the types of corporate businesses that can afford to play by these prohibitive rules get to dominate the landscape, and it's an unlevel playing field when the solo entrepreneur, let alone me, with a little bit of money, with my language, with my education, with the color of my skin, with all the privilege afforded me, has to navigate this gauntlet. What's it like for the people who don't have all of that?
But not only that, like entrepreneurs usually don't fit in boxes. We're all different, and we flow and coming and creating those and following and adhering those systems requires a completely different skill set. And when you look at cities around the world, the ones that are more interesting, they were not designed from scratch, from nothing. And then I'm not talking about Manhattan necessarily, because that could be interesting too, but it's a 1, 2, 3 square, and that's it. It's almost an energetic thing where if energy doesn't have an area to stop a little, slow, curve, and whatnot, and I think you're 100% right. Like the rules and regulations that adhere to a 400-seat restaurant, and which are required and needed, shouldn't be applied to a 10-seat stall or a small restaurant.
And like if you can create sandboxes, as you would call it in computer programming, like a safe place where you can do riskier things but limit the potential damage that you can do. So if we can create these sort of incubators, regular spaces within the regulatory framework that are a little looser to lower the barrier to participation, we could engender certain things. And then as they grow into more mature businesses, they can adapt to the more rigorous entrepreneurial thing. But, the idea that if you're a small farm and you want to keep 10 chickens and you need to follow the same regulations as a commercial egg farmer with a flock of 1 million, because that's fair, but it's not fair at all. And you distort the entire marketplace by doing so.
Yeah. Wow. So fascinating. You have a view that I really appreciate. You bring to light a lot of things that someone like me who's not necessarily in the industry per se would not necessarily see. So thank you for that. It could
be that because I'm not in the industry either, really. Like I came to this with no experience of food. Had I come from the food and beverage industry, I probably never would have done this because it would have seemed like such a terrible idea, had I known, how restaurants were run. And it was almost a combination of that foolhardiness, that beginner's mind, but also this idea of the designer, which is you give me a problem and then you come up with a solution to that problem. That's sort of what designers do. And this was just an unusual problem to solve. Yeah. And we found this peculiar solution to it. Now, is it scalable? I don't think it is, but then does that need to? Does it? Exactly. And this idea in entrepreneurship gets sometimes overwhelmed by some of the values of that every idea that's of value has to be scalable and has to be able to make you rich and has to be franchisable. And I'm like, well, maybe if we're talking on the one hand about sustainability, maybe the other hand shouldn't always be talking about growth. Maybe we do look about, maybe enough is as good as a feast. And we can come up with things that don't have to be bigger than they are.
Right. Yeah. And there's a joy in that too. It doesn't.
But if the rents keep going up underneath you, you can't do that.
And the system of continuous growth as an indicator to health is a challenge, because where do you stop? And
it's directly opposed to the idea of sustainability. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's a great way to almost wrap it up.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we're getting close. We're kind of going to wrap up, but I have one quick question, although I'm not even sure if anyway, I'm going to ask the question, just what charity is close to your heart? But it kind of feels like Depanneur does just so much charitable stuff by being.
It's not charitable. It's not this idea of like the wealthy, using their divine benevolence to like graciously give to the less fortunate. It's about using what privilege I have to create more opportunity for them. But it's a small business. It pays my bills. I survive in it. It doesn't make a ton of money, but it's enough. And and I feel I have the greatest privilege of all, which is to get up every morning and work on something that I genuinely care about, that makes me happy, that feels like it contributes in a positive way. And that's worth itself a lot. So, it's not so much that there aren't great charities that do great work, but even the nature of charity and the nature of the nonprofit world itself is part of this larger, racket. It might be a hard word to use, but I mean, it all works within the gears and machines of this system, and it tends to often not, in order to do that, it can't fundamentally work against those interests at certain levels. Okay. Whereas you have greater freedom. It was easier for me to do good as a small entrepreneur than it was for me to do it as a nonprofit.
Right. Well, and it sounds like you're going to continue to keep doing good. And the book is going to be coming out in 2023.
With fingers crossed. I mean, technically we're jumping the gun a little bit. The ink hasn't dried. we've accepted an offer, but we haven't signed the contracts. So I have to be a little, I don't want to be preemptive around, and, until the
We don't want to
proverbial-
jinx anything, Len.
Yeah.
until the
Yeah.
proverbial fat lady sings, we'll have to see how it all goes. But
Okay.
one thing I will say about the book too, and in the spirit of relying on the community to create, and this, as I did my research into the book, I realized that probably the only thing worse than the Canadian food business model, restaurant business model, the only thing worse than it was the Canadian cookbook publishing business model. And there was going to be
No, it can't be worse than the restaurant business. I don't believe that.
It became clear that there was no way that a publishing contract was going to generate enough money to actually pay to have 100 contributors contribute to the book, because I wasn't going to ask them to do it for free. I've been paying them all for 10 years. I'm not going to start doing that now. Everyone's getting, even if it's a small honorarium for the contribution, that's the fundamental principle, is that you pay people for the work that they do. And so we actually had to come up with another, and again, like a different way. So we did it as a Kickstarter to raise enough money to make the book, and we put it out into the community, and it became the most funded Canadian cookbook ever in the history of the platform. And that itself is a testament to what we built over the last 10 years. And, we built the Depanneur for and by and with this community. And now we're building this book for and by and with this community. And I feel encouraged by what is possible within the communities that you build, not relying on corporate sponsorship, not relying on government grants, right? Not relying on the benevolence of some larger thing, but on our, it'd be too hard for me to do with my own bootstraps. They aren't long enough, but together we were able to do something great. And I feel really fortunate. I hope that that's also a lesson of the whole project.
Yeah, I think it's moving towards groups of individuals with common goals, moving the needle on different things.
Yeah, I really believe small business can be an activist medium, and that you can use that to affect some kind of change in the world.
Well, that's a perfect way to wrap it up. Yeah, perfect way to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Len.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I've really been a delight. And Ellen, you'll be happy to know that we're literally eating your pitas.
Len, I wanted to get you to curse more, but that didn't work. So that's okay.
Okay.
But thank you. And also, it's funny. Like you blew me away, and because Liza, I don't know if you know, but Len was looking for some product, and he was driving by the bakery. I said, "Sure, of course. Just we'll have some waiting for you." And usually that's it, and that's fun. Like, we're really more than happy, and that's how we roll. But then I think the next day, Len sent me a text or an email saying, thank you for the product, we appreciate it. And I imagine you don't want money, but then he made a donation. I think it was more than the worth of the product, Len. So thank you for that. But he made a donation towards, I don't remember what organization it was.
Well, actually, and I'll clarify this just from a few things. It's not a donation, it's a micro loan. It's Kiva.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
I apologize. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
I was blown away, but apparently I'm blown away, but my memory is not that well. So
the principle is there, is that, and it started very early on in the Depanneur, where I had this idea called give and take, which was like people were donating things that the Depanneur needed, and they wouldn't let me pay them. So I was like, well, you know what? I'll take what I would have paid, and I'll put it into a loan for women food entrepreneurs in the developing world. And since then, we've been doing that in the background all throughout the history of the DEP. And then when we did the Kickstarter for the book, we earmarked $5 from each book to go to the loans to this. And we raised $3,500 to give as loans to over 135 women food entrepreneurs around in 36 different countries. So
Len, we need to
paying it forward.
Are you in? Tell me when you're in the city. I'm going on Saturday for 10 days, but let's have lunch together and see,
great.
just chat. Because I
Anytime.
think we have a few commonalities, at least
no doubt,
in terms of values, and I want to be a little more involved because I am in my sabbatical now.
Oh,
so
nice! Congratulations.
Thank you, and I have a book coming in November. So
very exciting.
It's
What's
funny.
that called?
It's a memoir also. I'll share with you.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, so it's an interesting trip too. Okay.
Well, as we wrap up, just let people know where they can find you, or social media, websites, and just all that.
If you
stuff.
look for the Depanneur, that's thedepanneur.ca. It's the Depanneur on Facebook. It's the Depanneur on Instagram. You'll see our listing of upcoming events. During COVID, we've pivoted to pick up food only. So we do every Wednesday, every Friday, we invite a different guest chef to make a pickup meal. You pre-order online and you pick up at the Dep. Starting next week, or actually this week, we're dipping our toe back into cooking classes for the first time since lockdown. So we're starting our small 12-person cooking classes, and we're going to be running that through till the end of the year. And then we'll see if 2022 starter looks like the sabbatical year I've been thinking about for quite some time.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Well, good luck.
What should happen will happen.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Good luck.
Amazing. Thanks, Len.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Len.
Bye.
Take care.
The Upfront Toronto podcast.